Welcome to The Imposters. This is a podcast about expertise. Who gets to define it? Who gets recognized as an expert? And whose knowledge is overlooked in humanitarian and development spaces? The Imposters recenters aid around affected communities and lived expertise. In each episode, I speak with refugees, migrants, and Global South practitioners whose expertise is shaped by experience, context, and leadership. These conversations explore what expertise and legitimacy look like in the sector, and how imposter syndrome is often a systemic outcome rather than a personal failure. Each guest joins the Imposters, an archive of lived experience experts in global development. We are a growing network of practitioners committed to elevating lived expertise in humanitarian and development work. I am your host, Laila Raouf. Welcome to the Imposters. Today on The Imposters, I'm joined by Jill Barasa. Jill is a strategic operations and environmental governance professional with over a decade of experience leading complex, multi stakeholder initiatives across Africa. Her work spans government engagement, conservation, and natural resource governance, and cross sector collaboration and support of sustainable development. In this conversation, we explore imposter syndrome and systems level work and what it takes to translate strategy into meaningful, grounded impact. I'm so excited to welcome Jill to the Imposters. Hey, Jill, how are you?
Hi, Lila. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me here today and for the invite to be part of the Imposters. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about my experience with you today.
Me too. I'm so happy to have you here. And I do try to start every episode the same way with the same opening question, which is: do you ever feel like an imposter in this work, especially in high level, multi stakeholder, or policy spaces?
Absolutely. It's sad just how often it happens, but it's always something that I try to battle at all stages of my career, or I've tried to battle at all stages of my career. I think it's shown up in many, many different moments throughout the years, particularly early on when I'd switched from international education to environmental management. And with this new role, I entered really high level policy and governance spaces. And I often found myself in rooms with very, very senior policymakers from the US, from different African countries, from Europe, international donors, technical experts who had decades of experience. And at the time, I was relatively young. I was 25. So I was often the youngest in the room, and I was one of the few African women in the spaces. So you can only imagine the level of imposter syndrome that was weighing on me those early days.
I was wondering I was wondering if you were gonna reveal your age at the time, because I know that you were really young when you, like, moved into this work, but I didn't know if you were gonna try to, like, be humble or not. But I was gonna out you either way because I remember when we met in DC and we had a group of friends, we never really talked about our jobs, and then one day it came up, like, years later, I realized you were, like, a director of some organization, and I was, like, 26 years old. So,
Yeah.
it's been a long time coming, but I'm glad, 8 years later, I'm able to welcome you to this project because you're, like, the original badass, honestly. Like, since you were, like,
Thank you.
20 years old, you've been running things.
It was always I think it's so one of those things that's always gonna come up because I think it's really shaped how my career has gone. I'm grateful that I always had someone in my corner in every organization that I've worked with who didn't necessarily look at my age, but I can tell you my age has been an issue in a lot of other situations outside of work, which plays a role into my imposter syndrome, but we're working on it. We're always gonna fight it, so
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, considering your career, I mentioned that you built a career across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Is there anything that originally drew you to environmental governance and systems level work, or was it a coincidence?
It's a little bit of both. In terms of environmental work, This is something that's always been at the back of my mind. Like I said, I started my career working in DC. I joined the first nonprofit that would hire me. And at the time, that was international education. I gained the best experience starting out there. But when it comes to the environment, that's something that's always been on the back of my mind. That's something at a space that I always wanted to work in. The environment is all around us. What we see, the land, the air, the water, like is something that I've always cared about and wanted to transition into. And I was always looking for that first push into it. So when I was finally able to switch into this career, it was kind of a dream come true. I was able to transition from the DC office to the Nairobi office and go back to my roots because I'm Kenyan American, but I never really saw that opportunity to come back to Kenya so early in my career. And it turns out I got to do it in a space that I'm quite passionate about.
Yeah, you're like the poster for like chasing your dreams. Looking back, are there some key moments or like transitions that shaped how you now approach leadership and strategy?
I think one of the biggest transitions in my career was moving from program implementation into more strategic and coordination focused roles. So like I said, when I my first role in international education, I really was a program implementer through and through. It was grant management, running programs at the basic level as a program officer. And when I transitioned into environmental governance, that's initially how I started. It was really heavy on program implementation. And so initially, I was working much closer to project level activities. And over time, my supervisors at the time were guiding me and helping me shift towards more coordinating programs and partnership across countries and institutions. So having that guidance was really a key transition moment for me. It got to the point that I was able to ask the organization if I could transition from the DC office to the Nairobi office. And that shift really required a different type of leadership. I was moving more less from simple project level implementation into more systems thinking, relationship management, and long-term strategy. And yeah, I think a lot of it just had to do with having a really good people behind your back and also having that confidence to ask that question to my senior management.
Yeah, I didn't realize you asked to be transferred to Nairobi. That's amazing. So, this project, The Imposters, is really centered around recentering lived experience as expertise rather than something like supplemental or a nice to have. Really, I'm all about claiming lived expertise as knowledge. And, you've spent so many years navigating these like complex governance environments. How would you say your lived experience shaped the way you understand expertise, especially now that you're back in Kenya working?
So I'll jump back first. I think my understanding of expertise has also evolved significantly through my professional experiences. Like, I would think early in my career, I associated expertise primarily with the formal credentials, the technical specializations that a lot of times I was often like, "I don't have," but that's all how I associated it. I didn't think of my experiences as lived experiences themselves or my lived experiences as expertise themselves. But over time, being exposed to these different countries and institutions, it showed me how contextual intelligence itself is just another form of expertise. And my experience living and working with these different institutions actually has a function and being able to understand how decisions get made within government systems, how local communities interact with environmental policies, for example, has been incredibly valuable knowledge just because I've found that being Kenyan and being African and being put into the situations, you're able to connect with people at such a quicker level than if I was straight up an American just coming into these spaces. So a lot of what I've learned over time hasn't really come from textbooks. It's been from navigating the real world, building these relationships, building these partnerships with people directly, and also just being able to understand these governance systems more closely than someone who's coming from abroad. So yeah, that level of understanding what works and doesn't work has been my saving grace to a certain degree. And these experiences have really shaped how I think about leadership and even just simply how I think about decision making and being able to put myself in those shoes a little bit more closely.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That was so well put. I'm wondering, as a follow up to that, Do you have an example in your work where you've seen how like local or community knowledge can strengthen large scale strategy or policy efforts?
Yeah, I have 2 examples actually. The first one that really stands out to me came from supporting this large scale initiative that was being developed in Southern Africa involving governments, private sector organizations, and international partners. And this was happening across 12 countries. So our organization was invited into the process to play a convening role. So just to be a convener and help coordinate stakeholders and support engagement within this initiative. So we were simply bringing in different sectors into the conversation. But one thing that became really clear very early on was the importance of ensuring that regional expertise and leadership were visibly centered in this initiative. So this included picking out experts within those 12 countries, local experts within those 12 countries, and making sure they were visibly centered throughout the process. And what I found really important slash powerful was how the governments and the regional partners themselves were keen in ensuring the initiative reflected regional ownership, making sure that African voices, expertise, and leadership were central in these conversations. Since part of our role was coordinating the public-facing moments like conferences and convenings within Africa, within the US, and even in the UAE. But they really wanted to make sure that while the international organizations could play an important supporting and convening role, the public facing leadership and technical voice of the work needed to reflect people who understood the regional realities closely. I think my lesson there was really that even when international organizations can bring the technical expertise or coordination support, long term success of projects like this really depends on who communities and governments see themselves reflected in, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely.
And the other example came from working in South Africa, actually. The project that we were working on was plastics recycling and waste management, and we had funding to support educational exchanges for legislators. This was focused on recycling systems and environmental policy. And because the funding came from partners in the UK and Switzerland, there was an assumption that the exchange would likely involve these countries. But what was really interesting is that the South African members of parliament themselves expressed very, very strongly a preference to learn from other African countries. And in this case, they chose Kenya. And their thinking was very practical, to be fair. They wanted to see solutions that were already being implemented within a context or within an environment that felt institutionally relatable or economically relatable. They
Mhm.
were interested to see in what's already working in an African setting, what barriers existed, and how can that be realistically replicated in South Africa. And I think for these MPs, or sorry, for these members of parliament, sorry to use acronyms, but yeah, for these members of parliament, the question wasn't necessarily what's the most advanced model that we can use for plastics recycling here, but they really wanted to see what realistically works here and what can we adapt. And it was just a great example of how expertise doesn't have to flow from north to south. I think that tends to be the assumption, but sometimes the most useful exchanges and knowledges comes from peers that are navigating similar constraints or similar systems. And yeah, so just looking at similar realities, navigate looking at countries navigating similar realities allows for lessons to be more transferable and more impactful in the end.
Yeah, I think, earlier you used the phrase contextual intelligence,
Mhm.
which I hadn't heard before, but, that's a really powerful phrase. Anything else you wanna share related to those examples?
Yeah, especially with South Africa. I think the idea was never really to exclude anyone or exclude the international partners from being part of the process. I think the lesson there was just that while these international partnerships are incredibly valuable, the strongest strategies usually emerge and succeed when local and regional perspectives are centered, not necessarily as an afterthought, but as the core expertise. So I think sometimes the most important question isn't necessarily what works, but like what works here in this context. And for the people in these institutions, for these communities and this political reality. Because I think the lesson is simply like the people closest to those realities hold the important answers to the questions that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. So, moving into your practice, again, much of your work involves aligning governments, NGOs, and private sector actors. What makes multi stakeholder collaboration genuinely work? And where does it most often break down in your experience?
I think what makes it work is listening. What I've seen is my role has always been to play a convener. What I've found is all these different stakeholders have their own incentives, their own goals, their own ideas, and getting someone to put them in the same room to come to build this trust has been the most difficult part of the existing system. It's there just really is no trust between the different stakeholders that I've seen, or there's a lot of competition between the stakeholders. So I've found that the best way to try to do this is to build trust with each of the different stakeholders and kind of come in as a neutral party, being able to understand each person's needs, being able to listen to them and bringing them to the table has been my key skill necessarily. So I've always said I'm a convener. I'm not coming in with my agenda. I'm not coming in with my own ideas of what the right environmental management project that should be implemented, because that's usually is the challenge. The government has its own priorities. The NGOs, civil society organizations have their own priorities. The private sector wants profit, so they have their own priorities. So getting them to sit down and actually trust one another and be able to come to solutions that benefit the communities in the end can be a quite difficult process. But being the person that plays more of a neutral convening role has been my saving grace in that sense. And that's been the reason why I've been able to build these relationships with the different stakeholders and build a platform of bringing them together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up trust and how that's kind of a strategic skill, honestly, is like fostering trust between people and stakeholders and fostering relationships in general. And I wonder if that connects to the answer for the previous question, which is about how you kind of have a different level of understanding because you share community and culture as working in Kenya, and maybe that helps you kind of foster trust. Would you agree with that?
100%. I think what I've seen is that progress tends to happen when people feel respected. So when you're coming in almost I perhaps I can use the word peer, yeah, almost as a peer, as someone from there's a level of respect that is automatic. Like, people don't feel managed from the get-go of the projects, which I think really, really helps to build that trust. So I found that I get to play this type of translator role, like a bridge builder between these different entities, and that's where you find that the trust is built over time.
And from my understanding, environmental and conservation work often sits at the intersection of urgency and politics, but then also like long timelines. Um, how typically do you navigate that tension in practice?
I mean, it's, to be fair, that's one of the parts that I've struggled with a bit in this type of work. So it's a difficult question because policy change is really slow, and sometimes it's so distant from what communities need and where programs need in terms of like making change happen really quickly. So I think over time, I understand the strategic side of policy, how it sets the rules, it sets the long-term direction. But what I'm really looking now to do within my career is try to bridge the world between policy and implementation and programs that actually deliver results relatively quickly to communities. Working within the policy world has been good in terms of like I've developed the systems thinking level of working, and I've been able to focus more on making sure that long game is kind of set, like the foundation is set. But in terms of the long game, what I've been looking towards transitioning into is more so global operations and program delivery, particularly within philanthropy or mission driven organizations, just because I want to work in a space that is more strategically quicker and supports innovation at a quicker scale, where you can really help scale solutions that help governments what I've seen over time is the value of public-private partnerships. The African governments in general, we're resource constrained. That's the simple part of it. So you really need the private sector to come in and kind of fill the gap. So finding the right stakeholders that aren't necessarily coming in with their own agendas is the difficult part, but I believe it's doable and I've seen it happen in certain scenarios when it relates to national resource management. So I've been keen to transition into a space that like the resources are there already, and now it's really a matter of implementing some of the ideas that the public sector, now the government has. And my role really was that. A lot of the work that I was doing was we're doing capacity building for policymakers. The government was allowing our organization to come in and not necessarily train the policymakers, but give the policymakers a platform to make sure that they actually understand the challenges that are happening in their own countries, be able to interact with the NGOs that are working in their own countries. Because you'll find that when we speak to these NGOs, a lot of them are quite jaded. They're like, oh, these policymakers, they don't even understand. They're not willing to help us. But at the base of it all is these are your policymakers. If there is no good foundational policy in place, the long game is compromised. What I've realized is that as I'm someone who enjoys seeing strategy actually translate into action, you really have to play both sides of the game. Even though policy is a long game, it's not something that can be ignored. So, how do you bridge the policy side with program delivery? Because the communities and the people still need results quickly, but policy change takes years and years and years. So, it's a challenge that I'm still working on solving, but I have my ideas.
Yeah. I don't, expect you to have all the answers, Jill, but I was even from your answer, I was like reflecting on how would I answer this question? And I think my career has also taken a similar path where I feel like I go back and forth between policy space and program implementation and policy space and program implementation. And I think it's helped me because, like you're saying, I understand the policy world, which is important as a program implementer. But also, because I've worked in program implementation, I know like the biggest critiques of policymakers as well. And so I really think that's kind of like the best route forward is have to just like continuously educate yourself so you can go back and forth and kind of like advocate for all sides of the coin, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I don't know, I've always enjoyed my work because of that aspect of just being a convener. Like, I have no stake on either side. I just want everybody to work together. Like, I'm more like, I just want peace. I just want all of us to collaborate to work. So it's been an easier role to play without having to fall on either side.
So I know that you have recently transitioned into consulting while you're pursuing further leadership training at Johns Hopkins. So what prompted that shift exactly, and what are you learning about yourself in this phase of your career?
In a weird way, I think it was my imposter syndrome, which is funny to think about. I think I found that I'd been working for about 7 years within my career, but I still was falling back into, like, the old patterns, the old idea that, expertise is tied to, your credentials, your degree, what your background. So I think I got to a point within my career where I probably got a little too comfortable. Then I was looking around and I was like, wow, I feel like I'm falling behind a little bit. I don't have a master's degree yet. So, and I also felt like I was working really, really deeply within the environmental management space. And a little bit of it, I'd kind of just learned on the job. So I made the critical decision that, okay, I'm going to pursue my master's initially part time while I was working full time. I was doing my MBA in public and private sector leadership. And then in the middle of that, I also opted to do an environmental management degree, which was a postgraduate degree. So it was only about 7 months long in Germany. And while I was in the program in Germany, throughout every lecture we had, every class we had, I realized that I was actually very, very qualified to be where I was within my career. Not that I wasn't learning anything new necessarily, but I found that a lot of what I was learning was theory. I had the experience already. So learning the theory, learning the foundational information was valuable. However, I found that I already had the practical knowledge that I needed to thrive within my career in terms of the environmental management space. So I don't think I wasted my time in Germany. I had a fantastic time. I It was good to do that those exchanges, and it was the cohort was different. Different. It was about 20 of us from different countries, all within the global south, and that experience I wouldn't trade for anything. It was just amazing to interact with other environmental management professionals within that space. However, I think doing this program kind of chased away my imposter syndrome temporarily because I realized I actually was where I was supposed to be career wise. And I had the knowledge that I needed to do the work that I was doing already. But when it comes to my MBA, I think that's training that I did need in terms of like just strengthening my financial acumen in general. That's been a really, really key part of why I went back to school because to a certain degree, I want to grow in my career. I want to be able to pursue new opportunities. And I think pursuing the MBA has given me that opportunity. So no regrets there, and it's been a really good degree in terms of, like, being able to build relationships with colleagues across the world as well. It's functions more of a more of an executive MBA, so being able to interact with individuals in different fields, different spaces, different parts of the world, it's experiences that you can't really trade for anything.
So you said that when you were in Germany in that cohort, you were like, "Oh, I'm smarter than everybody." So imposter syndrome gone, cured instantly.
I wouldn't say that exactly, but close. No.
But are you saying that when you, like, transitioned into your executive MBA with Johns Hopkins, like, the imposter syndrome came back? Is that what you're saying?
No, 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 not in that sense. I think Johns Hopkins helped me realize that I definitely needed to be where I was. I think Germany showed me that within my career, within environmental management, I I didn't need to have the imposter syndrome. Like I had the skills. Like it's basically going back to the lived experiences. I had the lived experiences to be doing the work that I wanted to do. However, when it comes to growing, I think my MBA has been a different differentiator. It's gonna put me. I think it's gonna differentiate me moving forward on top of my lived experiences.
So, like we were talking about earlier, the systems level work and the policy work can be like so slow and then also really
Mhm.
demanding. What has helped you like sustain clarity or motivation over time in this work?
I think what's helped me stay grounded is remembering the broader purpose behind the work. Like I said, the environment is all around us. So being able to remember that in the long run, we're protecting the ecosystems, we're supporting communities that don't necessarily have a voice at that level. So when I think about contributing long term to sustainability, that's something that helps me stay grounded. And I've also just learned to maintain balance and perspective. And sustaining motivation is in this field requires taking care of yourself and recognizes systemic change is a very long journey because trying to push policy it's challenging. Like all the different actors that you're interacting with, the different priorities that you're balancing, it's quite difficult and everybody knows what the end goal should be, but getting there is just so difficult. So that's quite difficult to accept in certain days, but being able to just understand that it's a long-term game and we all have the same goal in the very end helps.
Yeah, that's really true. And, I totally relate to what you were saying earlier about like policy work is so slow. I want to like work in, a faster paced environment. And, I relate to that because I used to work in emergency management, which is, like, so fast-paced, almost too fast-paced, though, and then I transitioned into international development, which is, like, so slow, it takes forever, especially in education, it's, like, generations before you see, like, outcomes and change, and it's, like,
Yeah,
so hard, at least for me, to sustain the motivation, but like you said, I do think it comes down to, like, balance, definitely taking care of yourself, having, like, really strict boundaries with your, like,
yeah,
compassion.
and making sure you don't get burnt out.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so easy to get burned out, especially, like I mean, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I have always, like, selected outside of emergency management, most of my career has been around, to me, it has to do with my lived experience because my family is from Egypt and I grew up in the United States really kind of not with not a strong sense of, like, that part of my identity and that part of my background and culture, so a lot of my career has been about regaining some of that I believe was, like, taken from me, in the United States. So work that I do, especially, like, development humanitarian work, I tend to stay within the sphere of, like, North Africa and the Middle East because it's
Mhm.
culturally, like, more similar and relevant to me, which I enjoy because I'm able to apply some of my lived experience but
Yeah.
also almost makes it more tiring too because then it becomes personal, right? And
Yeah.
so there's that extra layer of when we talked about lived experience, it's also like some limitations, like, you're doing the work for your country and your people, but also it's exhausting at the same time because it's personal. So I don't know if you can relate to that at all.
No, 100%, 100%. And even now, as I've been trying to transition, like, as I think about I graduate in May, what I want to do next, there's a part of me that's like, I don't have all this Africa experience to even explore any other roles, you know? Because, I mean, like, who else is gonna do it if I leave this space, if I leave the environment space? But there's a part of me that's like, "Oh, it is so hard." Like, it would be nice to, like, just not think about this for, like, a few years and come back into it. So it's yeah, it's very challenging and it's but in the long run, it's I think the personal work makes it more valuable. I think if I try to transition into a different field right now, I'll look back and always wonder like why did I leave? So the personal aspect of it is what makes the work it what keeps you pushing, it's what keeps me running.
Totally.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's gonna be so many people, hopefully people listen to this project, but people who listen to your episode in particular who are gonna be really inspired and, like, hopefully, renewed motivation in the development and humanitarian sector, which is just so challenging these days. So,
Absolutely.
what would you want early career professionals working in governance or sustainability or even development to know about their place in this work, maybe their voice, their authority, or even their lived experience?
I would encourage anybody working in these spaces to recognize their own lived experiences early on, along with their professional experiences. Development and governance work often involves a lot of uncertainty and complexity, and your perspective that you bring within your own context, from your own communities, from whichever professional journey you're coming from, it's incredibly valuable. You don't need to go by don't be like me. You don't need to go get an MBA and an environmental management degree to find this out. Your lived experiences are far more valuable than you'll ever imagine, and it's needed in this space. And there isn't one path to expertise, and there isn't one path to contributing to meaningful change. So just understand that, yeah, you're valuable. Your experiences are incredibly valuable.
Yeah, that was a really great answer. Especially when kind of reflecting on your lived reality. And I wish, like nowadays, not nowadays, gosh, I sound so old when I say that, but I feel like there has been a trend.
Mhm.
Back in my day, nobody cared about your lived experience. But
Mhm.
there's definitely been a shift in the past, maybe 10 years. And now we're really seeing it bubble up onto the surface, like shifting towards prioritizing lived experience and maybe even shifting towards localization. And hopefully, and that's kind of one of the motivations behind this project is to feed into that conversation and really uplift some of the voices who are lived experience experts. So, yeah, if anything, I wish, like, this had happened sooner in my career because it's just now that I'm starting to, like, really value those parts of my professional experience. Well, is there anything like, I know you're finishing up your degree soon, but, like, is there anything on the horizon for you that you're excited about, or what's next for you, really?
Yeah, what's next for me right now? I'm just finishing school actually. So I'm in the final 2 months of my MBA. I'll be done in it's March, right? Yeah, May. I'll be finished. So I had no career prospects right now, but we're in the job market. So just doing a lot of networking and looking for a new opportunity that hopefully keeps me in Kenya.
And if, like, others wanted to, follow your work or connect with you, how could they get in touch?
I'm easily accessible on LinkedIn. It's Jill Barasa, Barasa. So you can easily find me on there. Happy to connect with anyone, happy to chat with anyone early in their career, any guidance that I may have or may provide. Really more than happy to. I think, like I said earlier in the podcast, I was lucky that I've had 2 jobs overall in my career, but within those 2 jobs, I've had champions in my corner who have really guided me and who have put me in positions that allowed me to enter leadership roles. So, if I can be of guidance to anybody, if I can support anybody in that way, I'd be more than honored. So, yeah, please feel free to reach out, feel free to connect with me.
And that's such like a takeaway point from this episode, I think, is like find your champion. Well, thank you so much, Jill, for, speaking with me today. As we close out, I just want to thank you for sharing your journey and your insights so thoughtfully. Your work reminds us that leadership in complex systems is not just about strategy, but about patience, lots of collaboration, and staying grounded in your purpose. So we're so excited to welcome you to the Imposters. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.